Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back. I hope you enjoyed yourself at the mansion and had a wonderful time out there. How was it? Yes. So we've had an extraordinary 24 hours since our time at the State Department together, looking at the state of the world and democracy, and we looked at the long view of American history this morning. Some incredible conversations. I really enjoy all the participation and the enthusiasm. And tonight, we've got a fantastic appetizer before our beautiful dinner that we're going to have after this. Two of the great leaders in America right now are going to tackle some challenging subjects related to democracy and capitalism. I do have one note. We found a ring on the ground. If anybody needs it, let me know how much it's worth and we can have a conversation. We're always looking for an opportunity here. So let's go ahead and have the voice of God. As you know, we don't do bios here. It's all in your book. You can read about these two incredible men. But I do want to say a personal thank you to Ken Griffin and David Rubenstein for taking time out of your extremely busy schedules to be with us tonight in Mount Vernon. So let's welcome the boys up to the stage here, and let's have a good conversation. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome David Rubenstein and Kenneth Griffin.
So, Ken, thank you very much for coming here. And I wanted to ask you, how many times have you been to Mount Vernon before?
So this is my first time here.
Okay.
And David, thank you for bringing me here today.
So do you have it, as a boy, you probably read about Mount Vernon, and now that you're here, did it look much different than you thought, or?
The problem is, as a boy, is now a long, long time ago.
Okay.
Turned 55 a few days ago, and I'd like to be back in those days of being a boy again.
Okay. So when you grew up in Florida, and you have a strong bent towards capitalism, you're obviously one of the country's leading capitalists and investors. Where did you get this from? Was it something you were ingrained in by your parents, or was it something somebody taught you in school that you really believe in capitalism? Where did you get this kind of strong belief in the value of capitalism?
So I think it's important to appreciate, I've always been actually interested in government. And at Harvard, I studied economics and government because I was just so in awe of what this country represents. And part of the story of our country is the fact that we embrace a free market. And free markets allow people to pursue their dreams. And my grandparents pursued their dreams. My grandmother grew up with no running water. My grandfather had not much more. And they literally lived that American dream. They started a small business with the money that my great-grandmother had made from selling chicken eggs. And that small business, when my grandfather passed away early in life, was the nest egg that my grandmother used to put all 5 grandkids through college. So I've seen the American dream play out very, very personally in my family. And capitalism is a part of the American dream.
So for those who aren't familiar with your background, you grew up in Florida, and obviously you must have done reasonably well in school. You got into Harvard, right? So were you...
Well, back then, Florida was the diversity box.
Okay. So famously, when you were at Harvard, you were trading securities. Most people at Harvard are protesting something or another or doing something, but you were trading securities, and the legend is that you had to get special permission to get a wire, because people may not remember this, but in those days, you couldn't get direct quotes on your cell phone because there were no cell phones. So tell us a story, if you can, how you got interested in trading and how you had to do something at Harvard that enabled you to actually trade securities.
So I was in college, and there was an article in Forbes about how Home Shopping Network was overpriced. And I bought 2 put contracts on Home Shopping Network, and a put pays off if the stock goes down. It's like being short the stock, but with finite risk. And sometimes we are lucky in life. And the stock cratered shortly after I bought these puts. I made something like $2,000, which in college, okay, that's all the money in the world. But to give a condensed story, I became very interested in the pricing of options and derivatives. and started a small partnership in college with a group of friends to trade a portfolio of derivatives. And to do so, I needed to access real-time prices. And before the dawn of the internet, and my son, who's 15, is like, Dad, like, you were alive before the internet existed. One of the ways that you got real-time prices was actually by satellite. And Harvard did not want students to run businesses out of their dorms back in the 80s. They were worried about their tax status. They took an extraordinarily conservative position, which I now understand better. But at the time, young in college, idealistic, the building supervisor gave me permission to put a satellite dish on top of the dorm. And I threw the cable through a window on the 5th story, ran down the hall, down an elevator shaft, and into my room. And that's how I got a hold of real-time prices to trade from my college dorm room.
Well, whoever allowed you to do that should get an award, because you've given Harvard $500 million since then, at least, right?
So I think that Gene is very fondly thought of by the administration to this day.
So recently, or maybe about a year or so ago, there was an auction of the U.S. Constitution, a rare copy, one of the early printings of the U.S. Constitution. And at the time, there was some publicity about people who were, I guess, cryptocurrency people who were saying they were going to buy this. And ultimately, you prevailed. What made you want to buy the Constitution? You're one of the greatest art collectors in the United States. You have an incredible collection, but I hadn't known you as a document collector. So why did you decide to buy that document, and what are you doing with it now?
So first of all, I think all of you know that David is actually one of the greatest collectors of American historical documents.
Well, but not anymore. I mean, so I was afraid that now the people who see in the art world, if you buy a painting for $100 million, it's not that unusual. In the document world, it's very unusual. So I was afraid that the art collector world would show up in the document collecting world and make it impossible to buy things anymore. But you told me once, I think, that you weren't going to buy that many documents. At least maybe I heard you say that. Maybe I wanted you to hear say that. But what propelled you to buy that document?
Well, I mean, first of all, I think David owns most of the great documents. So unless you're looking to sell your collection to me. So the Constitution, going back to my youth, I was always fascinated in American government, and the admiration I have for the draftsmen of the Constitution, and the fact that we came together to create such a remarkable form of government is one of the greatest accomplishments of mankind, because from that foundation, we built this great nation. And when it came up for sale, I remember going to Sotheby's, and I've been to Sotheby's many times, and usually I like that, I want that, I'll pursue that, or I won't pursue that. It's about the only time in my life I said, I'm going to buy this. And my only concern was that Jeffrey Bezos or Elon Musk said the same thing, because then they would buy it. But it was really a chance to own one of the most sacred documents in the history of our country, and a moment in the history of the world where mankind transcended all prior forms of government.
Right. So where is that document now?
So right now, this is sort of depressing. It's in a dark vault. Oh. And let me tell you why. It went from Sotheby's pretty much right to Crystal Bridges, where it was the cornerstone of an incredibly important show on the history of America, and was seen by hundreds of thousands of people. And it was a hugely successful show, and it brought into Crystal Bridges many people have never set foot into a museum. So I was so thrilled with that. But as you know, the nature of the printing used at that era means that you only want to expose the document to light so many days out of a certain period of time. And with the celebration of our country coming up soon, and it'll be Lent again for that moment, this is a time for the document to rest, and then it'll again be shared with a major institution here in America.
So at the Constitutional Convention, the presiding officer was George Washington. So you ever thought that if George Washington hadn't presided, there wouldn't be a Constitution? At least some people say that.
There's no way I'm not going to have him answer this question. So, David, what is your view on that?
My view is that actually, I'm sure everybody here probably knows this, but George Washington was worried that the Articles of Confederation were not working. The Articles of Confederation required every state to agree on something. It had to be unanimous, and so they couldn't agree on many things, and there was no taxation ability, and there was no ability to raise an army. So he thought the country was heading south. So Alexander Hamilton and James Madison persuaded him to go to a convention in Philadelphia. It was really supposed to designed to amend the Articles of Confederation, but actually produce a constitution. And he was clearly the only person who could preside and make people really listen to him. And he did preside, and I think when they were drafting the Constitution, they had him in mind as being the president. So many of the provisions there, like making the president commander-in-chief, were really tailored for him. And I think it was generally the view that without him, we wouldn't have had a Constitution, and without him, we wouldn't have had it ratified, because he provided some support for the Virginia ratification, other ratifications. So yeah, I think he was essential for it. But you probably agree with that, right?
Absolutely.
Right, okay. So talk about democracy. Recently, in the United States, there have been many people who think that our democracy is not working so well. Members of Congress can barely agree on passing a budget, let alone the bills necessary to keep the debt from defaulting. Does that worry you that our democracy is kind of faltering a bit?
So that's actually, it's a great question. So number one is, I think it's fair to say that our founding fathers did not want government to be extraordinarily flexible, agile, and able to implement. There was a skepticism of the scope of government when we founded the United States of America, and government is almost by design intended to be plodding and slow-moving. And I think there's actually a lot of strength to that. We don't get caught up in populist waves that sort of swing our country back and forth. Now, having said that, I mean, how many days have you woken up just depressed about the state of Washington over the last year or the last few years?
Well, I think it looks pretty bad right now because the Democrats and Republicans don't seem to be able to feel that bipartisanship is a good thing. And it used to be that bipartisanship was valued, and if you were a good legislator, you were thought to be able to work with the other side. Now, if you work with the other side, you are often shunned by your own party.
So there's some of that. There's always been some of that. I think it's certainly more accentuated today. I feel much better today than I did 3 weeks ago.
Because?
We actually have a Speaker of the House. We can actually enact legislation again. And there's some very important legislation that we need to enact as a country right here, right now. We need to support the Ukraine. We have to ensure that Putin cannot realize his dream of taking the Ukraine, because the next country to the west is a NATO country. And the insurance premium that we should pay to ensure that Ukraine stays part of the Western sphere, stays a free country, and keeps Putin away from NATO, this is the easiest legislative decision that we should have. And then at the same time, we need to support Israel here in the context of the Middle East. And we need to make sure that America represents its national security interests everywhere in the world. And I think we will see the two sides come together to make this happen.
Well, hopefully you're right, but are you surprised that the Republican Party, and I don't know if you're a registered Republican, but you probably support more Republican candidates than Democratic candidates. Is that fair?
That's fair.
So are you surprised that the Republican Party in the House, at least, seems to be backing away from supporting Ukraine, maybe because of pressure from Donald Trump? Does that disappoint you or surprise you?
Look, I think this goes back to one of the challenges in our country, which is education. That if we don't teach history and we don't teach people how to engage in critical thinking, then they become easily persuaded by very shallow arguments. And at this moment in time, particularly when it comes to issues of national defense and national security, we really need to make sure that our legislators in Washington think carefully about history and think carefully about what steps do you take to prevent a war. Because it's much more important to prevent a war than it is to win a war.
So many people say that our democracy has been challenged a bit because of the influence of money. And you are a large donor, so do you feel that money is too important now in our politics and there should be constraints on it? Or do you think it's actually a free expression type of thing and there should be no constraints?
So that's another great question. Money is certainly part of the dynamic in American politics, and it gives politicians a voice. It gives them a chance to deliver their message to voters. I've been involved in supporting candidates for, 25 plus years. No amount of money turns a bad candidate into a winning candidate. It can give a candidate a chance to have a voice. It cannot change the stripes on the zebra. So what's really important is to find good candidates who have solid principles and to support them in their pursuit of office. That's what gets good people into Washington. But this theory that elections are being bought is just absurd. Elections are won by good candidates, usually, who have the right positions, usually. And then money is important, particularly in a world where much of the press leans very left.
Okay.
So if you imagine a nation in which there was no ability for politicians to raise money, and yet the press, as liberal as it is today, where would U.S. politics be? They would be far further left than where they are today. And to be clear, I'm not trying to make a statement that left versus right is what matters most. What matters most is the debate between the two sides, because truth is almost always in the middle.
So you just said you turned 55. So in 25 years, you'll be old enough to be president of the United States. So would you consider in the next 25 years or so, when you're aged, that you might run for president yourself?
Well, I think it's really important to repeat something I've said before. In 25 years, it's the perfect age not to be president. And I would really like to see both parties have a far younger, far more dynamic candidate competing for the White House.
Well, you're 55. Are you interested? I think George Washington became president of the United States when he was, 57? Is that right? Something like that?
So I can think about this for 2 years.
You've got a couple years to think about it.
I can think about this for 2 years.
You haven't, we talked about this before, but you're not likely to be a candidate in the near future, but you wouldn't rule it out at some point in your life.
I mean, I've always had an interest in government, always, like from the time I was a young child. And of course, I've thought about, would I ever consider running for the House or the Senate or governor over the course of my life? It's something I'll think about, pursue, consider, make a decision on.
So let's talk about the Constitution a moment. You own one of the rare copies of the Constitution. Suppose that you had the ability to change the Constitution, had some amendments. What would you like to do to make the Constitution work better?
That's a great question. So I'll do the following with you. I'll pick one, you pick one.
Okay.
All right. I would certainly require there to be a long-term balanced budget. So we don't have to have a balanced budget every year, but we can't keep funding America today on the backs of our children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren.
Well,
now I'll turn it to you.
I understand the arguments for the Electoral College. I understand why we have it, and it was actually not really debated that much in the Constitutional Convention, but it came out of a committee and they adopted it. They couldn't agree on how to elect a president was one of the things they couldn't agree on. But I think a direct election of the president, while it has its challenges for sure, would lend more credibility to our claim that we are a democracy, because presumably the majority candidate would win. Today, we have a situation where somebody who, let's say in Donald Trump's case, he lost to Hillary Clinton by, I think, 3 million votes. He became president of the United States. We've had 5 cases where the minority candidate became president because of the Electoral College. So I would probably opt for that. Would be a change I would strongly consider. Though I recognize in the current environment it's not going to happen, but if I could make a change, that's probably one of them. What other change might you make?
So I would really try to understand how to end gerrymandering.
Okay.
And the issue with gerrymandering is we continually encourage extremists in both parties when we make a district solid red or solid blue. Now it becomes a competition amongst extremists, often in our primaries, and that results in people in Washington who really shouldn't be in Washington.
Yeah, it's a phenomenon I've talked about before, and just for those who may not have heard me say this, today members of Congress spend about 40 or 50% of their time raising money, and they raise money from the far left and the far right because there's nobody who gives money, or very few people give money to somebody who's down the center. And so that's why you often have Congress not being able to talk to each other, because the far left is funding some people on the left and far right is funding people on the right. And the result is very little room in the middle. I wish we could find a way to avoid that. And gerrymandering is one of the ways that this current system fosters that problem.
So actually, here's where I'm going to disagree with you. So I know a number of the largest donors on both sides. In fact, I had a chance to be with a group of some of the most significant Democratic donors recently on a debate around the direction of the Democratic Party, which was really fun for me to be in that room. But here's the big picture. The vast majority of the large donors I know are looking for people who are in the center. The media is infatuated with people who are in the extremes. They make better stories. It creates more clickbait. There's much more drama and personality. It's actually, I think it's easier to raise money if you're in the center. I think it's easier to win if you're part of the extreme.
Well, let me give you my comment on that, would be that for people like you and large donors, for sure, that's kind of the perspective you have, give something that's going to work. But for example, when there was the fight recently in Congress about who the speaker was going to be and getting rid of Speaker McCarthy, Matt Gaetz was sending out ads to his constituents or his fundraiser types for raising $5 and $10 million increments. And every half hour he was saying, I'm going to get rid of the speaker, I'm getting rid of the speaker, I'm standing up for you. But he's trying to raise $5 and $10 and $15 million donations. So people who are actually funding a lot of House members are actually relatively smaller donors than people who are funding presidential campaigns.
Right, so he's seeking small dollar donations, $5, right. $10, $20. And it can add up to millions of dollars. And it's unfortunate, but there will always be people who'll be motivated by the extremists. I mean, that's just what it is. And the key is that those of us who care about our country have to fight to keep this country run by people who are in the center.
Let's talk about education for a moment. You've been a big proponent of making certain that education is, taught in a good way, and you've been very, I think, vocal about this. So what is your principal concern about the education system we currently have in our country?
Well, one of my partners was in a public school in a city I'll leave nameless, and it was before a moment where we would celebrate a piece of American history, and he was in a classroom of sophomores, and the War for Independence came up, and he just threw out the question, who did America fight in its war for independence? And one of the students raised their hand and said, Germany. And he's like, well, that's the right continent, so let's go from there.
Right.
They did not know who we fought our war for independence from. And it's very hard to have a functioning democracy when you have no knowledge of our history.
Well, Richard Haas has written a book on that. He talked about it last night at the State Department, but we have very little knowledge of civics and history compared to what you might want. I'll give you one illustration of this. Is there anybody here that's a naturalized American? Anybody? Okay. A naturalized American, to be a citizen in this country, the old days, you could just show up. There wasn't, in the early days of the country, you didn't need to have passports or visas or anything, but ultimately we passed immigration legislation and so forth. And the law that we have today essentially says if you're a resident for 5 years and you want to be a citizen, you have to take a test. And that test gives you 100 potential questions, which you study. The questions are things like, how many branches are there in the federal government? Who's the first president of the United States? Things like that. 91% of the people that take that test, 91%, pass it. So these are people came from elsewhere, and we have 50 million immigrants in this country. Not all of them are citizens, but of the people who've taken that test, 91% pass. The same test was more or less given to people who are naturally born in this country in all 50 states about 3 years ago. And about 2.5 million people took the test. And not surprisingly, you can see where this is going. Only in one state could a majority of native-born Americans pass the basic citizenship test that foreigners have to take to become a citizen in this country. And
do you happen to know the state?
I'm sorry?
Do you know the state?
It's Vermont.
It's Vermont.
And only 53% there.
I still think Vermont gets a round of applause for that.
Right. So in this country, to come in as a naturalized citizen, you have to, the 100 potential questions, you're asked 10 of them. And if you're 65 or older, they tell you which 10 you're going to get. I don't know why they want to help people 65 or older.
Imagine if you were 80 and running for president.
I don't know. Maybe.
Do they just give you the 10 answers?
I don't know. But anyway, so today, to be a citizen, you have to take six out of 10 questions. All it takes. And again, sadly, majority of Americans, native-born, couldn't pass that test in every state except Vermont. So back to your situation, the capitalist system.
But I think it's really important to think about, right? We're talking about how do we defend democracy. If you don't understand the history of our democracy, if you don't understand how this country saved the world twice in 2 world wars, if you don't understand how this country has been the center point of the vast majority of innovation in the world over the last 200 and change years, then you say, you're in no position to judge how important this country is to protect.
Well, I don't know if you can mention his name in this building, but Thomas Jefferson, he said an informed citizenry is the key to a representative democracy working. Obviously, we don't have an informed citizenry. You get not a great democracy sometimes. Let's talk about capitalism for a moment. There are many people who think that capitalism today is geared towards making really few people very, very wealthy and a lot of people very, very poor, and is leaving people behind. And in some countries, this country, we're seen as not having as big enough social net compared to what they have in Europe. So how would you defend capitalism as being a good system for economic structure in a country when you see so many people left behind in a country like ours?
Well, I mean, first of all, this goes back to understanding history. People in Russia were pretty much dirt poor when the Cold War came to an end. China, under Mao, had 50 million people starve to death. I don't see the glory in communism or socialism. There's no story of 50 million Americans dying of starvation. And the Chinese actually embraced free markets to pull 1 billion people out of poverty. The greatest success story in the world in combating poverty was the Chinese embracing of free markets. And they didn't embrace it as we do in America. It was like a partial embracement of free markets, took 1 billion people from poverty into prosperity. So here in the United States, number one is a capitalist system, a free market system works best when you have an educated workforce. So it goes back to the very same issues that make democracy more fragile, a poorly educated population, also makes capitalism feel less equal because the playing field is not nearly as level in terms of the starting skills. You know, in Illinois, there's 53 schools without a single child at grade level. How will they be successful in any economic system in the world when they're effectively functionally illiterate in this day and age? And remember, the United States, our economy competes with every economy in the world. Americans have to compete with people in China, in India, in Germany to produce goods or services. So we first of all have to educate our children if we want to embrace a free market system. But having said that, the free market system is the single best way that we know to allocate the time of our citizens and the capital of our country to solve problems.
But if you could change the capitalist system that exists in the United States, is there anything you could do or would recommend that we do to make the system better than it is?
Absolutely. I would, first of all, I'd focus on educating our children. Number two is I'd place far more emphasis on post-high school technical career development. How do we make sure that people learn trades like carpentry, to weld, to fix automobiles, rather than having them pursue degrees in four-year colleges that are often not particularly marketable? If you're going to go to college, how do we encourage people to have engineering and STEM degrees? Much more marketability than you have in many of the degrees that we have today from American schools. I mean, it was heartbreaking. I was on a river rafting trip in Colorado, and the guide is like, I studied English at a second-tier school, and this is the best I can do for a job. I mean, how awful that somebody spent 4 years in college and cannot find a high-paying job in our economy.
Well,
So that's
Okay.
part of this, all right? Number two is we need to have a much, much stronger safety net, not of financial resources, but of financial resources and job training for those people whose jobs become rendered irrelevant by the triumph of technology. And we're about to see this again. We're going to see AI dramatically change the landscape of American jobs. I mean, if you work at a call center, it's going to be a tough job to find in 5 to 7 years, because we're going to have servers and data centers that answer that call with a human voice. They're going to answer it precisely. They're going to answer your question perfectly. You're not even going to realize you're talking to a computer. It'll be that good. And that's going to displace a lot of American workers, just as we will finally get to, and it'll happen in our lifetimes, it'll happen in the next decade or decade and a half, we'll have fully self-driving cars and trucks. That's a lot of people that will need to find new jobs. We don't have the jobs training programs that we need to have in America to help people land on their feet when changes happen in our economic landscape.
So I think you and maybe Mike Bloomberg are the two most generous donors to American higher education today. You've given to many different universities and quite large sums. Are you upset about the protests that are now going on and some of the anti-Semitic protests you see in some of the universities? And are you concerned that this is a wave that we're not going to be able to stop in the future?
What was the word? Am I upset?
Well, are you concerned about what's going on in the protests?
Concern comes nowhere close to the feeling.
So,
there is no room in America for calling for the genocide of a people. You'll find I am a huge proponent of free speech. And that creates some very difficult moral conundrums. But in our universities, you need not save a seat for a student who embraces anti-Semitism or the genocide of a people.
So while we're here, people may not know your background fully, but Ken is one of the, I would say, most successful investors in the world today, one of the most successful hedge funds and separate securities business that's one of the most successful. So for people that might be looking for some free investment advice, what do you think the average person who doesn't have your access to all the information you have and all the skilled people you have, what do you think the average person should do with his or her money if they have $100,000 that they're not sure what, or even $500,000? Should they put it in an index fund, or should they go to a hedge fund, or what do you recommend the average person do with his or her money?
So I believe that a traditional, something close to a 60-40 portfolio, and that weight would change depending upon where you are in the journey of life, but bonds and stocks, passive index funds make a lot of sense. Passive bond funds make a lot of sense. Like, that's a very cost-effective way to manage your money and to earn the market returns. Now, passive investing is actually rooted in the theory that markets are efficient, and that markets are efficient because of active managers setting the prices of securities. Firms like Citadel, firms like Fidelity, firms like Viking Global, Capital Research. We're all running large teams of people that are engaged in fundamental research, trying to drive the value of companies towards where we think they should be valued. And passive investing, in a sense, enjoys the market efficiency that we create in our work each and every day. And one of the things that's very frustrating in Washington, D.C. is actually the regulatory weight being placed on active managers by the SEC, who are in this moment where they've introduced 50 new rules in proposal or final form over the last roughly 18 months. It's almost as if they're in a jihad against active management and the active allocation of capital in the United States. That hurts passive investors. That hurts the ability for companies to raise capital at the right price, to create jobs and to build factories. It's really like, you asked, what would I change in Washington? I would ask that our agencies run through the lens of how do we embolden American businesses to win. To win. And when we attack financial services firms, which employ a tremendous number of Americans who manage wealth for people all over the world, these are high-paying jobs where the individuals involved are paying a lot of taxes. I almost scratch my head, like, if the progressives don't want people who make money and who pay taxes, then how will they ever fund their dream? Like, I can't reconcile that.
So many people have said that we are heading into a recession, but we seem to have dodged it for the time being. Nobody likes to say for certain whether we're going to be in a recession, but are you worried about a recession coming?
I mean, here's the bottom line. There'll be a recession one day. Like, I'm absolutely certain and I will be right.
Okay.
But economists, the old joke is they predict something like 10 of the next 5 recessions. And right now, we do have this very interesting moment where we have inflation that's much higher than historical trends. It's being fueled by the profligate spending out of Washington. That spending is helping to push off the inevitable recession that will always happen in our economy. But we're funding this moment of largesse, again, on the backs of our children. We'll have a deficit this year of about $2 trillion. Now let's put this in context. We're gonna have a $2 trillion deficit with unemployment at 3 and change %, with 9 million open jobs. The economy, in many respects, never gets better than this. And yet, at this moment in time, we're not saving for our rainy day. We're spending like drunken sailors.
Well, related to that, the $2 trillion is going to be added to roughly 33, 34 trillion we already have of debt. So why did I've been wondering, why do the markets not respond to that? The markets seem to be absorbing this debt. The dollar doesn't go down in value, and the markets seem to be not upset about all this debt. Why are the markets not so upset about all the debt we have?
Oh, I think the last 50 basis point move in the 10-year over the last few months has been driven by the realization of just how out of control our spending is. And in particular, the CBO came out and said, we're going to be looking at 5% deficits for several years ahead. I mean, this has really got the market spooked. What we don't know is as we start to saturate foreign demand for U.S. treasuries, how much higher will yields need to climb domestically to induce American pension plans and American households to shift their money, and this is a scary thought, from stocks to bonds. And as we shift from stocks to bonds, we're taking money out of the productive part of our economy, where we create factories, where we create jobs, and into, frankly, funding the spending of Washington. And if you think Washington's better at creating prosperity than the private sector, right, we need to go back to that basic conversation around education.
Okay, so let's talk about for a moment the inflation that we have in the Federal Reserve. How do you think the Federal Reserve, in your judgment, handled the inflation when it showed up post-COVID? Do you think the Federal Reserve missed the boat and now think they've done a good job in moderating the inflation, or you think they should have done more earlier?
I mean, so here's the big problem. If you're Powell, you have like one of the worst jobs because you will be measured with hindsight. Now, clearly with hindsight, they would have raised rates earlier and faster. I don't think they knew how much of the inflationary spike was supply chain related or related to other factors, nor probably did they appreciate just how much we'd see in spending out of DC. right? It's like the Fed's trying to cool the economy to bring inflation down. So they've got the foot on the brake of the car. And then our friends in the House and Senate and White House are spending money like crazy. They've got their foot on the gas. It's actually like this in a car, right? Where's that car go? If you're in an F1 car, you're doing circles down the racetrack. It's a nightmare. Like, that's a really tough place to be. And that's the challenge that Powell's had in running the Fed, is everything that they're trying to do, they're facing the ramifications of Washington spending more money and creating more legislation that drives up the cost for the American consumer.
So in the presidential campaigns, you've been involved for over the years in helping some candidates with support. Are you, at this point, you're staying out of that race?
So I'm watching this from the sidelines right now and really trying to understand where the key candidates in the Republican primary are going to land on issues that are important to me. This next debate's a really important debate. I hope NBC does a good job of having a policy debate. The American voters need to hear policies. They need to understand what we're going to do in issues of national security, education. They need to understand what we're going to do to grow our economy and to combat inflation. So I really hope the team at NBC is focused on those issues and not trying to have more of the, I mean, they're entertaining sound bites between the candidates as they attack each other, but that doesn't really tell us who we should vote for.
So as you look back on history of people who you think were good leaders, in addition to George Washington, are there political leaders or governmental leaders you actually particularly admire? And are there business leaders that you see as role models for what you're trying to do and are doing?
Well, so what's the exact title of our panel here? It's Democracy and Capitalism. So let's look at this through the lens of that, all right? Bill Clinton did a fantastic job on economic policy. Did a fantastic job. NAFTA was under Bill Clinton. And the economic integration of North America has been, when it's all said and done, a home run. Here's something that people take for granted in the United States. When's the last time you woke up and worried about going to war with Canada? Think of how few countries in the world that you can make the statement that you never, ever worry about going to war with your neighbors. You don't even joke about it. Like, we have such peace in North America, and we have such relative prosperity. It's remarkable. He did welfare reform. And that was important in getting more people into the workforce. And unemployment during his time as president, again, was in the low 3%. And then, this is hard to believe, he signed a budget with a surplus. And I know this because we traded the 30-year treasuries of the United States, and my traders are like, well, what happens if there's no 30-year treasuries left to trade? Because the government was actually, they stopped issuance.
Yes, I think Alan Greenspan at the time said, what are we going to do if we don't have treasuries against which to measure corporate bonds? That's not a worry anymore. But, and I try to explain to people, a surplus means when you take in more money than you spend in government terms, and that's last happened under Bill Clinton.
Right, it's been a long time. And then before Clinton, obviously Ronald Reagan was extraordinary in getting us out of our funk and getting people to think about the future and investing for the future. And people lose sight of that. When they believe you've got a strong leader in Washington, they'll take more risks with their businesses. I mean, we can sit here and debate the pros and cons of Trump all day long. I'll tell you this, we invested so much money back into Citadel and grew so rapidly. It was an incredible moment in the history of my career. Change administrations, all of a sudden, regulatory onslaught, the tone from Washington, distinctly anti-business. Well, you really take a step back and go, how fast do we want to grow? How much do we want to reinvest? How much do we focus on cost cutting? We're not focusing on being an offense. We're focused on staying like let's keep getting one foot in front of the next. But it's a very different tone.
We've invested a lot during Trump's period of time, but you're not supporting him now.
I think I've been pretty clear. I'd love to see somebody younger in office, and I'd love to see somebody who could serve 8 years.
Okay.
Like, I think continuity in the White House is important, and if we had a president who could serve 8 years, that would be a really good thing.
Are there business people that you particularly admire over the years that you've either met or read about that you think are done great things in building our economy or doing great things in the investment world?
That's actually a pretty long list. That's a pretty long list. I mean, okay, so yeah, I mean, when it's all said and done, you have to love Steve Jobs. You may find his personal life to leave you wanting, but Apple has changed the world. And this is one of those great stories of what capitalism does bring. You know, companies that are successful are companies that solve the needs of a consumer. People forget that. In the anti-capitalist rhetoric, businesses that sell products that people don't want go bankrupt. And businesses that sell products that people really want, like Apple, prosper. And Steve Jobs was a genius in understanding how to make technology accessible to the average person. I mean, my kids can navigate around an iPad, an iPhone, an iMac, as if it's just a part of them. It's just unbelievable. And everyone in this room has kids or grandkids would say the same thing. Like, I know it. So Steve Jobs was just an incredible, incredible visionary. At this moment in time, I mean, Elon Musk is just, I think he's certifiably crazy. How many people think they're going to revolutionize an industry? And he thinks he'll do that with Tesla. In fact, he's doing just that. But that's like one of his jobs. The other one is he's transforming space with SpaceX. I mean, I don't know anybody who has the range and breadth that he has in managing two distinctly different businesses that are both transforming really critical parts of the economy. I mean, for people who live in rural America, Starlink's is game-changing. Access to ultra-high-speed internet access for children, this is an important way to help to sort of deal with the digital divide.
Right.
It's unbelievable what he's doing at SpaceX.
Let me ask you, recently, when you left Harvard, you moved to Chicago, and you built Citadel in Chicago, and you were, I guess, the most successful business person in Chicago, probably all of Illinois. And then about a year or two ago, you said, I'm done with Chicago, I'm moving to Florida, where you grew up. Was it because of economics, the way that the government worked in Illinois, or was it crime, or what was the reason that you felt you should move your business to Florida? And did Florida have an economic system you're happier with?
Well, I'm going to unpack that question just a little bit. All right.
Okay.
30 years in Chicago, and those were 30 of the best years of my life. But towards the end of that journey, Chicago changed. It embraced a set of policies that really changed the character of the city and resulted in a tremendous increase in criminal activity. I mean, it's hard to imagine this, but in the time I was in Chicago, there were 25,000 people shot to death. And the pace of crime was accelerating in the last couple of years, not decelerating, in a moment where the mindset of defund the police just gripped that city like you can't imagine. And it's been really difficult to see a state that I called home torn apart by politics. When you have people who are in office who are more interested in their own, in this case, presidential aspirations with the governor, I'm not sure what aspirations with the former mayor, were willing to pursue an agenda that was just devastating in our ability to retain talent in Chicago and to attract talent to Chicago. So keep that in mind as one vignette, a city where 30% of the stores on Michigan Avenue, the preeminent shopping district, are now closed, where you can't walk on the streets at night because of crime. And if you do walk on the streets, you're getting high from just all the marijuana in the air, from all the dope shops that have been opened over the last 3 years. We had a number of our colleagues go to the Four Seasons in Palm Beach for the pandemic. We created our own bubble. We built a trading floor in 5 days. From that trading floor in the Four Seasons in Palm Beach, I know it sounds crazy, we could trade the entire US stock market. Like every share that traded in the United States, we could handle. We did it in 5 days. We had 200 people working 24 hours a day to build that trading floor. They shot rockets down the streets through the pipes to connects to the high-speed internet backbone that crisscrosses America. It was unbelievable. The people that went to Florida and lived there over the pandemic said, we don't want to come back to Chicago. And they were some of my most important people. And they said, we don't need to live in a city where there's anarchy. And that really is what pulled Citadel out of Chicago, was the fact that my top people had had enough. And so we have moved hundreds of people to Miami, a substantial number of people to our New York office, and we're moving forward. But it does highlight the importance of good government. You need to have good government to have your business community prosper. And I'll tell you what, the mayor of Miami-Dade, she's a Democrat, and she's a rock star. And the mayor of Miami, he's a Republican, and he is fantastic. And they work together to create a strong civic community, a strong business community, and a working, functional, pro-people government.
So at the moment, you haven't decided who you're going to support for president, but presumably you'll support one of the candidates, I assume, don't you think?
Well, I'm going to vote at some point in time.
Right, okay. So, but do people call you every hour on the hour and say you should vote this person, you support this person, or how do you deal with all the presidential candidates that want your support?
Look, I've had a chance to spend time with many of them, and there are those who probably won't win, but would be, I think, very, very, very good in the Oval Office. And there are those who may win, who I think have the talents to be really good in the Oval Office. I mean, Nikki Haley, for example, has the foreign policy experience that we need right now. And again, we'll see how her policy positions stake out over the course of the next debate and in the weeks ahead. How will she resonate with the American people? She's somebody I'm really paying attention to. There's a lot of strengths with her.
So you have had the advantage of having your mother see your success. I always ask people what it's like to have your parents see your success. Your mother is obviously very proud of you. When she calls you and says, Ken, you should be doing this, or Ken, you should do that, what do you say? You say, I'm the most successful investor in the world, I don't have to listen to you, or what do you say?
Wow, okay. I have 3 kids, 15, 12, and 11. Do you know advice I get? You know what I get from mom most? Oh, sorry, 12 is now 13. So happy birthday. So 15, 13, 11. Mom calls to tell me how to be a better dad. And there's no way you're gonna fight with your mother at that moment in time. You're just gonna go, yes, Mom. And she has really great advice. She was incredibly committed to all 3 of her children. I'm so blessed that she was so involved in my life. And she's a great grandmother, and she's really just wonderful to talk to in dealing with the issues that go with having children.
So a final question I'd like to ask you about is you obviously have embodied the American dream. From a modest background, you've risen up to be one of the most successful business people and investors in the United States and the world. You obviously believe in the American dream. Why do you think so many other people today, particularly those born in the United States, don't seem to believe in the American dream as much as people who are immigrants coming here? And was the American dream something that you believed in such that it propelled you forward, or do you not really think about the American dream when you were building your business?
Oh, I mean, I'm 17-year-olds and at Harvard, right? You're at one of the greatest universities in the world. How do you not realize that you can go for any of your dreams with an education like a Harvard education? Right? Like my education was my on-ramp to the American dream. And it's part of the reason I'm so committed to education, both K through 12 and college, is how do we make that on-ramp as big as we possibly can for as many Americans as we possibly can. And the challenge is when that on-ramp has a bunch of potholes because you put the interests of the teachers union in front of the interests of the kids, you take away the ability to realize the American dream. And it's you would almost view where our education system has landed in America as a foreign country has taken over our government and is interested in turning us into their serfs. This isn't that capitalism is failing, it's that our political leaders are failing. It's that our voters are failing to force our political leaders to take on the issues that are endemic in our schools. I did a dinner in Chicago for a number of the top principals. There was no ask. There was just, we're just going to have a dinner to celebrate your commitment to education. There was no speaker. There was no agenda other than a nice meal and a toast of thanks. And when you were with those principals and you heard the struggles that the children and parents face in trying to educate their children in a school system dominated by union labor laws, you literally just wanted to cry. I mean, there was the group of kids who were in 8th grade at a middle school who wanted to take algebra in a very poor middle school, and the union rules prohibited the teaching of algebra in that school. And a parent would pick the kids up every day at 11 o'clock, I don't remember the exact time, and take them to a local high school, the kids, to get an education, wait for an hour and drive them back to the middle school. I mean, how utterly absurd is this as a reality in the United States? And people talk about China as a competitor. Let me be clear. They are one hell of a competitor. You know this, I know this, we both do business there. They educate an extraordinary number of really bright, driven people. We do need to compete with China, and we're going to do it by fixing our schools in K through 12. And I just hope we do it before it turns too late. I really do.
Ken, thank you very much for thanks very much for coming here for your first visit to Mount Vernon, and thank you for being a role model for many investors and for many business people, and thanks for standing up for I would say freedom of expression, because you've been one of the biggest advocates for that. Thanks very much for coming.
David, thank you so much.